Everybody, welcome to Chapter 13, Section 3 Notes, the effects of the New Deal. Remember to pause the video anytime that you need to so that you can keep up with the writing. So we're looking at how the New Deal basically affected the United States through social means, economic means, and political means. So the main thing that the New Deal does is that it brings fundamental changes to the federal government and their role in American life on a day-to-day basis. So one example is the role of the first spouse, in this case, the First Lady. However, this January, we're going to have our second gentleman in reference to Vice President-elect Kamala Harris's husband. But Eleanor Roosevelt changes this role for the First Ladies. Now, she's not the first First Lady that presidents had asked for advice or bounced ideas off of. However, she's the first First Lady who fully becomes involved in her spouse's presidential campaigns and day-to-day operations. So she went from that ceremony, shake the hand, kiss the baby, welcome to the White House type of thing, to an actual political activist. She was a huge advocate for women's rights. She was the first First Lady who traveled on behalf of her spouse. In doing so, she campaigned for FDR several times because he was incapable of traveling due to illness. She offered advice to FDR. She was highly educated and she was well-versed on various topics. And so he really consulted her throughout his presidency on what to do. Now, did he always take her advice? Absolutely not. But often they were kind of hand in hand in their ideas and belief sets. She also maintained a job in writing a newspaper column. So she wrote a newspaper column detailing a variety of different things, and also wrote for some magazines as well. So FDR is the first president that really incorporates women into government in a way that's not belittling. So he nominates and appoints Frances Perkins as a Secretary of Labor. She's the very first female cabinet member in any presidential cabinet. Now, that doesn't mean that gender discrimination ended, as we well know that it still exists today. But we do see some changes. Now, in some things, women were forbidden from working from, or they were last hired to. So even within FDR's agencies, you have the WPA. They would employ men first, and that was pretty much the tradition because men were supposed to be the breadwinner. There was this stereotypical thing with that. And it was believed that women shouldn't be doing the physical work of the CCC because it was hard manual labor. As we now know, that's silly, but that was just the culture of the time. So that wasn't necessarily, an uncommon thing to believe that. Minorities are hit very hard by the Depression. So African Americans were... their employment rate was twice as high at 50%. Many people pushed for FDR to end racial discrimination. African Americans started voting Democratic. Prior to this, they only voted Republican because of Abraham Lincoln. But this is where that final push between the Republican and Democratic parties kind of switching their ideas. So the party of Lincoln really has now become the heart of the Democratic Party. And what was the Democratic Party becomes the heart of the Republican Party. So they've kind of flipped. Roosevelt not only talked to Frances Perkins, but he also talked to Mary McLeod Bethune. She was a member of his black cabinet. So he had, which is kind of weird that he had more than one cabinet, but Unfortunately, racial segregation was still very much a thing. But he had a cabinet that was called the Black Cabinet because he specifically wanted to deal with issues related to African Americans. So every member of that cabinet was an African American. One of the things that FDR doesn't do, and from what I read in Eleanor Roosevelt's autobiography, was probably one of his greatest regrets, was not supporting the anti-lynching law. And the reason he did not support the anti-lynching law, it's not because he was a fan of it or anything of that nature, but the reason he did not support it is because there was a small faction of Southern Democrats, we often call them Dixiecrats, that were still very racially biased. And he needed them to vote on other programs. So he left that alone. He did not touch that because he needed their vote in other areas. Unfortunately, some of the programs would hurt African Americans and other minorities. For example, the subsidies given to farmers often led them to evicting their sharecroppers. Well, sharecroppers were disproportionately African Americans in numbers. African Americans still did not have equal wages. And domestic and farm workers were often exempted from New Deal programs, meaning that they didn't get the benefits from them. So often these programs were hurting them. However, many African Americans also saw that FDR was trying to move the country forward. We have the New Deal's Commissioner of Indian Affairs, John Collier. He tried to improve these living conditions for Native Americans. And he, prior to this time, Native Americans were forced to live on reservations, and they were stripped of their identities, or trying to strip them of their language and their culture. But under Collier, we see a completely 180. He encouraged them to practice their religions and languages and customs. In the Indian New Deal, they received money to build schools and hospitals, and they created their own CCC to build native lands and to make them better. Does it solve the problem of the Native Americans? Absolutely not. But does it help them? Yes, it does. And it acknowledges them. We also have the Indian Reorganization Act of 34, and this is basically the crowning jewel or the glory of the Indian New Deal. And that allowed the tribes to have control over their own lands, meaning that they had their own court system, they had their own way of doing things, and it would supersede white man's law on the outside of the native land. This was huge for Native Americans. So Roosevelt was able to unite a great diverse Americans, which led him to become a political powerhouse, and actually led the Democratic Party become that political powerhouse. We have Southern whites, we have Northern blue-collar workers, Midwestern farmers, African Americans, and Democrats were now in the majority. And this is referred to as the New Deal Coalition. This will be important. Now, these Southern whites are not necessarily the same Southern whites that are Dixiecrats, but there are a handful of Dixiecrats that are enough to cause Roosevelt to be cautious because he needs their support to get his programs through. So the New Deal also helps unify our country. Prior to this time, if you remember from right before World War I and during World War I, people really belittled others of different ethnic groups and social levels. Immigrants decreased in numbers and volumes, but now their communities felt like they belonged. And then by creating the programs of the WPA and the CCC, it put people together of different racial and ethnic groups together, so they learned to understand that they really weren't that different from each other. So they developed a better community sense of belonging. So FDR also breaks the tradition of that laissez-faire where the government stays out of business. In expanding this role of government, people said that it would hurt and destroy capitalism, whereas really it strengthened capitalism. And it's going to become important in the economy, and then even past World War II, long after FDR dies. So the government has to be involved to continue that strength. For people, they finally now trust banks again. People start investing in the stock again. And under FDR, we have the largest number of home ownership in history at that point. FDR was known, and the Democratic Party became the party known to protect workers. And rural communities started supporting him because, they were getting advances that they did not think they would ever get by being modernized with electricity and water power and such. So when we look here, these are different WPA and PWA projects throughout the country that help the local economies. Now we have this concept of welfare state, and I think often that this statement is used incorrectly or without context. Welfare state meaning that the government is now responsible for the welfare of its country. Okay, employ the unemployed. This is that pump priming idea. By doing that, I think it builds a stronger sense of commitment from the people of the country to the government, ensuring that safety. Now, a lot of people would say that this is pushing towards a socialist idea. But, a lot of programs we have are socialist ideas. It's just we rename them and people don't realize that they're socialist ideas. FDR, like his cousin Teddy, protected the environment. So FDR established 12 million acres of new national parks. And the CCC that we talked about the other day went in and rebuilt forests and cleared out areas that were potential fire hazards. And honestly, we really should reestablish the CCC in large factions to handle the West. Maybe we can get more control of these wildfires in some of the areas. We could go on for days for that, but we don't have time. So I'm going to keep moving on. So as I told you yesterday, the other day, the TVA has mixed feelings because on one hand, do we sacrifice environment for progress, or do we sacrifice progress to protect environment? These are tough questions that political leaders have to address and handle regularly, even more so nowadays. So what was the effect of the presidency? As we can see here, this is already on your paper, but it says increased power of the president and the executive branch. FDR was the first to use mass media in the sense that it was not only to tell things, but to advertise or promote his ideas and trying to garner support. He expanded the role of how the president manages the economy and developed social policy. FDR will be the only president in history to win a third and fourth term in office. After he passes, we'll have the 22nd Amendment passed to limit all future presidents to 2 consecutive terms. After World War II and after FDR passes, people become weary and they want to ensure that we have that smooth transition. So that's why that gets passed. FDR will die shortly after the start of his 4th term, which we'll get into in the next chapter. If you have any questions or concerns or need assistance, please make sure you come to the Google Meet. Otherwise, I will see you on the next day. Have a great night.